We're back with video number 5 on our World Brewers Championship Boston experience. I'm going to say this intro a lot of times, so I need to figure out more fun ways to do it. Anyhow, this part is about the brewing device or the recipe. So the April brewer, it's the brewer we used. It's a brewer that we have been developing for the last year. We had one version of it in Brazil, and we have a slightly updated version of it in Boston. And the whole idea with it is to create a flatbed brewer and the kind of uniformity and evenness that comes with that, but create a faster flow rate. So similar to a V60, not necessarily the flow rate of a V60, but definitely faster and more consistent than a traditional flatbed brewer. So part of the challenge with, for example, a Kalita brewer is that the only way to get fast flow rate is to pour really aggressively in the center of the coffee or grind very, very coarse. But even then, from a competition perspective, you can have an inconsistency, meaning that for some reason the drawdown clogs up and you can't have that in competition. So that's kind of the backstory to how we started to experiment. We choose to make a ceramic because I want the temperature to be a bit lower. I don't necessarily believe in high temperature brews. And we just basically made a flatbed brewer with a really large hole in the bottom with it. Worked with a Kalita paper filter in it, which is for sure not the best paper filter. We're working on fixing that as well for the future to create our own, but that was basically what we brought up with. Recipe-wise, initially, some of you may already know this, but I actually went through a big change in recipe from day 1 and day 2. Being that we arrived in Boston and it tasted like crap. But before that, the initial recipe we went up with, which again is different from the national recipe because there's different competitions, whether you like it or not. And the ratio we went up with is 1:15. Slightly smaller brew than usual. Some people still do these really large brews, being like 300 mils, 350 mils or whatever. I don't like that, and I don't see the necessity of it, and it's also a lot of waste. There's a lot of coffee that no one will drink in practice and so on. So we worked with a 14-gram dose to 210 grams of water, which was basically the original recipe that we went to Boston with, meaning that's what I've been practicing on. We're alternating between circle and center pours. Center pour being aggressive, 6-second pour, 70 grams of volume. The circle pour being gentle and slow, also 6 seconds, but a circle pour, meaning that you pour a lot more water in the same amount of time on the center pour than in the circle pour. Now this will have a very different reaction on the coffee. So with the circle pour, the bed will be a lot more uniform and stable, and you won't really turn the coffee grounds around that much. Which is increasing a bit more uniformity and just balance in the cup. Whereas with the aggressive center pour, you're gonna actually stir the coffee up quite a lot, creating agitation, increasing flow rate, and if in my world, increasing flavor intensity as well. So it was about creating a pattern of pouring that generate a great harmony in the cup with focus on a harmony between hot down to cold temperature. So that's the kind of original version of that. We grind very coarse. I always believe that grinding coarse generates higher quality flavor notes. I don't necessarily have a proof for that, but it's just experience. And to some degree, that's, experience is all you got, and that's what you need to go with. Water temperature has continuously changed quite a lot, from 88 in the national to 90 originally in the first round in the Worlds. Again, lower temperature brew, I find that to be more consistent, tastier. You need to be a bit careful with the acidity. If you go too low, you can basically you risk not extracting the sugars as much as you want to, so you get a more acidic cup, if that makes sense. So if you have a coffee that is very, very acidic, I would probably go up in temperature to increase more sugars, because acidity is not really reacting to that. So in my pitch in the presentation, it was a lower temperature to control that acidity structure, which is kind of true. But what we really controlled was the sweetness structure and the balance of ratio acidity and sweetness. Grinder we use, that's pretty funny. Again, everything changed from the first round to the second round. We'll go into that as well. First round I used Comandante, great grinder. Why do I use Comandante? Well, we're going to the US and we're competing, and in the US they have a different power voltage. And if you have a different power voltage, then I don't want to take a ditting with me all the way there and not being able to grind. So it kind of makes sense to just bring it. I'm happy I did. It served me well for a long time. The Comandante guys was really helpful to kind of clean everything up. Amazing. I used the Chaos scales as well. Again, I paid for all of these, so there's no kind of sponsorship behind this. We like to pay for good stuff, and I think what I can say, which was really helpful, was that this year they actually had a calibration booth. So we went and calibrated the scales right before the competition started, which gave us a really good kind of opportunity to make things a bit more consistent and to know where our scales were. We brought 5 scales, and it turns out that one of those were actually completely off. So that was really helpful. Water is a headache, let me tell you. That was a major mistake that we did that we won't be doing again. We did not bring a water. The reason for not bringing the water was that the water in Brazil, I was really happy with brewing that in my open service, and we ended up scoring very high. So I thought that Boston would be a good representation of that. It turns out that the minerals in the original water in Boston is vastly different. So the outcome was just this extremely mouth-drying cup of coffee, and we were not ready for that. So basically arriving in Boston, the first brew I did was in the hotel room using tap water. The coffee actually tasted pretty solid. I was pretty happy, and then I went to the competition, and it just tasted like crap. God damn it, it tasted like crap. It was so mouth-drying. The flavors were there, the structure was there, the acidity was well integrated, but it was just leaving you this huge, heavy dryness. And since cinnamon was one of the main kind of characters in the coffee, I couldn't have that. It was just like a dry cup of cinnamon. Didn't matter which TDS I didn't matter which, anything I really did, and that was so frustrating. So in the first round, we went up with basically a 14-gram dose to 210 grams of water, alternating between a 30-gram pour and a 60-gram pour. Total brew time of 4 minutes. 8 per brewer, of course, and a brew temperature of 90 degrees Celsius. And this was basically what I had been practicing with for 2 months back home in Gothenburg, and it tasted amazing. It's just that I used a different water. So we use our own version of a third wave dilution, which is a lot more water to powder than what they recommend. And we've been really happy with that. I personally do not understand the critique towards third wave water whatsoever. I think most of the competitor backstage using third wave water had some really tasty cups of coffee, and most of the water that I tried from other competitors were actually did not make their coffees beneficial or show them in a good way. So, big fan of that. But we went down there and we ended up competing actually with a third wave structure for the first round because we couldn't use the official water. It was just not up to standard. And again, the mineral levels were where people wanted within recommendations and stuff like that. But you need to understand that the recommendations or ratio recommendations that they have in the world is kind of big. Even the tables were basically made for tiny people. Nothing wrong with that, but that was one thing I didn't have in mind, because again, coming into Brazil was perfect height for me, and the judges were standing up. Now I was like hovering above the judges, and they were all sitting down, and it felt pretty crap. And these are just the things you need to take into consideration going up into the Worlds, where you just don't know what to expect. Don't freak out about it. And it comes back to what we said in earlier videos: just train on the worst version. Then any version that comes out after that would be a positive kind of, and I think that's the focus you need to have. So anyhow, that was the first presentation. And I'm going to be honest with you and say that I was pretty unsure that I would make it to the final. We still ended up with one of the better first rounds in the competitions. We're at 82, which was still very high, which was good, but that was just that the low level was very high, and we were fortunate enough to have that low level. But I competed on Friday, which means I practiced all Thursday, and I knew my coffee was bad on Friday, so I was in 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, and I brewed the whole fucking day. And one thing I can say is that out of the people that competed on Friday, I was the only one busting my ass the whole day on Saturday. And people were asking, like, what are you doing? You competed yesterday. But yeah, sure, but I'm training for the final, right? Because, you know, first of all, one, I didn't know if I would make it to the final. It didn't really matter. But if I made it to the final, I wanted to be ready and prepared for it. And I was a bit surprised over how, you know, a lot of people just, no, I'm going to wait for the final result and then I'm going to practice, right? And I mean, again, it comes back to this kind of mindset and focus. And, you know, the reality is that I came to Boston, my coffee tasted like crap, and I knew that. You need to know that. And then I spent a whole fucking day trying to figure out how to make it tasty. And it was me backstage, you know, with a bunch of other like competitors / coaches. And I was just, you know, again, it's amazing to be backstage. That's why I keep on doing this. Backstage in a world competition is you know, fantastic. It's one of the best experiences you can have. You learn so much. And big thank you to Nicholas from Malaysia. That was a huge help in this. Micah from Austria. I mean, a few other people. It was just amazing backstage. Of course, to my team member Joe as well. That was really supportive. But I mean, in terms of brewing, you know, those were the guys really helping me. And you know, we cracked out a completely different. This was the day before the final, right? And I never brewed in this way before, and we were trying to figure out how to do it, changing, you know, 12, 14 different waters. It was still not tasting very good. And the final recipe we used in the final ended up being 14 grams of coffee. So we kept the dose the same and poured 200 grams of water. So a smaller ratio than usual. Brew time was 3 minutes instead of 4 minutes. The pouring interval changes. The pouring amount changed to individual pours of 30-70 instead of 40-60. And you know, it just all changed. We changed the water, we changed the, you know, everything. And I was just standing there and like, fuck me, am I gonna go up and change my pitch on stage in the final? And I was like, yeah, because you know, you need the tastiest cup of coffee, because that's the pitch, that's the game, that's what we're in. And we pushed the score from 82 to 86. I had almost identical scores on taste description, workflow, and customer service from my first round in the final. What really changed was the quality of the cup that just went up, and we had the highest Opus score in the competition, and that was because, you know, we practiced. So, you know, I think the most important thing to keep with you with a brewing device, because we also get the question, you know, what kind of brewing device should I have? I mean, obviously, if you look at the statistics, you should have a V60, because V60 on average is doing incredibly well. There's no point disputing that. Do you get a lot of extra points for making your own brewer? I think the reality is no. It really is, and it kind of, you know, I don't spend much time critiquing this concept, and overall I'm just happy that we have a competition. But I mean, maybe there should be some kind of way to give points for you know, having your own brew method. The reality is that you get your score sheet and you see like people are commenting and be like, oh, this cool that has his own brewer. But there's no scores to be found there. You don't get better customer service. You get good customer service for explaining your brew method well, having a reason for why it's tasting the way it does. But you can do that with a V60. You can do that with an AeroPress. You can do that with whatever you want to use, right? So, I mean, it's a lot of work for something that doesn't necessarily generate any points. Now, that being said, we create our own brew method because we want to make our coffee taste the way that we want to, right? So it's not necessarily about performing well in a competition. We do this because that's the brewer I use on a daily basis to brew April coffee. That's why it's called April Brewer and not, you know, not something else. So, you know, it's just an extension of what we do here, and we think that makes sense, and you know, it's also an interesting process. So that's not really the point. I think you can use any brew method, you can use any water. You just need to be flexible. You need to realize that in the end of the day, this is a taste competition. So it's about how your coffee is tasting. If your coffee is not tasting, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what approach you have. It doesn't matter how good your presentation is. You focus on the coffee. And I mean, you know, train as much as you can. You're there competing, right? So, you know, if you compete in the first round, the first day, and have an open day before final, I mean, train as if you were in the final. Pretty straightforward. So I mean that's been the kind of focus that we've been having. So, and again, it's about customizing an approach that works for your coffee and what you want to do. It's not necessarily about finding a way of doing things that fits all coffees in the world, because that's, that probably doesn't exist. So you need to be a lot more specific when you're in your approach, and you need to focus on how can I make this specific coffee taste the best, right? That's why that's been the coffee I've been brewing. There's no other coffee even touching my Comandante. I mean, the Comandante has been exclusively for that. I should say though, for the sake of transparency, that in the final we actually didn't use the Comandante, we used a Ditting grinder. I think the main reason for that was a tiny bit of stress, where we kept on dialing in on the final as well, and we just needed somebody to work faster. I think that was one of the key things. So we actually used a Ditting grinder, which is a great grinder. It's a grinder we have at home as well. One perhaps interesting side note, which I'm not sure if everyone is thinking about, is that we actually we grinded our coffee about 30-45 minutes before going on stage, because your flow rate in your brews is going to massively be impacted based on the amount of gas in the coffee and how fresh the coffee is. So part of why we roasted it very fresh, we needed to grind it before to kind of let it rust and open up and be more consistent. So if you're brewing coffee out there and you have an issue with flow rate being inconsistent in between multiple, then just grind sooner and let it rust longer, and you're not going to have that issue anymore. So the longer after grinding, the faster the flow rate, basically. I think that was it about brewing. Again, if you guys have any questions, just write them down here. Thank you as always.